Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today. In this webinar, we're going to take a deep dive into air quality issues in Ireland in preparation for the National Clean Air Strategy consultation. If you'd like to ask a question during the webinar, please put it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And if you see a question similar to one that you would like to ask, you can just uptick that question with the thumbs up icon. My name is Clodagh Daly, and I'm Manager of Community Law and Mediation Centre for Environmental Justice. CLM welcomes the department's consultation on the important issue of air quality. It's an imperative that meaningful and effective public participation is enabled on this important issue. The deadline for submissions to the consultation is May 3rd, and the Centre for Environmental Justice will be making our submission available as a template for both individuals and organisations to use. So please keep an eye on CLM's Twitter page over the coming weeks. And I'm just going to share a couple of slides, if that's okay. So just to provide a very brief background on our work, Community Law and Mediation was set up as part of the Campaign for Civil Legal Aid in 1975. Today, we assist more than 4,000 people each year through the provision of free legal, mediation and education services. We also campaign for law reform and for the safeguarding of rights already enshrined in law. We work in areas of law that are not adequately covered by the Legal Aid Board, and so this includes issues such as housing, employment, equality, social welfare and debt, as well as access to services like healthcare and education. In February of 2021, we expanded our work into the area of environmental justice by setting up Ireland's first ever Centre for Environmental Justice. Environmental justice is not a concept that is very well known yet in Ireland, but it essentially ensures that groups experiencing poverty, inequality, or social exclusion are not disproportionately affected by climate change or by other environmental harms. And it also ensures that the state's response to environmental challenges is both inclusive and fair. And this is really important because environmental issues disproportionately impact the disadvantaged within our communities because they have the fewest choices about where and how they live, have fewer resources to cope with pollution or the challenges of climate change, and have less visibility in the shaping of policy responses. The pandemic highlighted the importance of clean air and access to outdoor space, which is particularly relevant and important to the vulnerable within our communities who may live in overcrowded living conditions or experience pre-existing health conditions. But air quality and access to outdoor space can often be limited or hampered by the presence of air pollution. We know that air pollution is being experienced in the communities that we work with because it has presented to our free legal advice clinics. The most recent report by the Environmental Protection Agency showed that about 1,300 people die in Ireland per year as a result of air pollution. And this impacts certain groups more than others because of where they live, where they can afford to live, and the level and quality of healthcare that they have access to, or because of existing respiratory problems as well. Air quality also affects young children who take more breaths and whose shorter heights means they are more exposed to more sources of pollution, such as car exhausts. Children's lung capacity can be permanently stunted and their health permanently damaged by exposure to pollutants at a young age. And this was clear from the conclusion of an inquest in London, which found that air pollution was a cause in the tragic death of 9-year-old Ella Deborah, who died of respiratory failure after exposure to excessive air pollution. Ella lived only 25 metres from the South Circular Road, one of London's most polluted streets. And according to the Environmental Protection Agency, people of lower socioeconomic status tend to be disproportionately exposed to environmental pollution, including air pollution, and this may be exacerbated in the future without appropriate policies to protect those most vulnerable in society. And so with this in mind, we are also very conscious of the escalating issue of fuel poverty in Ireland. Between December 2020 and December 2021, the cost of electricity rose by 22.4%, while gas prices increased by 27.7%. Energy costs are now 34% higher overall compared with December 2016 prices, and up to 28% of households may be in fuel poverty, which includes 165,000 households with older persons. That's according to Age Action. So many of these households who are in or at risk of fuel poverty may rely on traditional sources of fuel, such as turf or wood, to heat their homes, without being aware of the really significant health consequences of doing so. So the negative effects of emissions caused by burning of solid fuels can be compounded with serious impacts on health and well-being. Air quality then is not only a matter of health, but of economic and housing justice, and it is really closely linked to energy poverty. In terms then of our right to health, the EPA's State of the Environment report states that air pollution is the single largest environmental health risk in Europe. This is echoed by the World Health Organization, who have found that air pollution is the single leading cause of death from chronic diseases after smoking. Poor air quality is linked to serious health implications, both in the short term across issues such as headaches, breathing difficulties, and eye irritations, as well as in the longer term, including issues like asthma, reduced liver function, and cardiovascular disease. The Constitution and European Convention on Human Rights Act each protect our right to health, but equality rights are also relevant here, given the uneven impacts of air pollution across different groups in Ireland. Equality rights are set out in the Constitution as well as in international and EU law, including the EU Charter on Fundamental Rights and the EU Equality Directives. The public sector equality and human rights duty lends even further weight to the need for a human rights-based approach to air governance in Ireland. Dr. Orla Kelleher is going to speak to us in more detail about Ireland's legal obligations on air quality, but it's worth mentioning that although monitored levels of air pollution generally tend to remain within EU limits, they often exceed World Health Organization standards, which are more stringent and therefore safer. A recent report from Ireland's Environmental Protection Agency showed that air pollution exceeded World Health Organization standards at 38 out of 67 monitoring stations. And this is even more significant given that the World Health Organization published its new global air quality guidelines in 2021. These new guidelines present science-based recommendations for concentrations of the major air pollutants, and they suggest much lower values for the main pollutants, particularly particulate matter. This includes things like dust, dirt, smoke, and liquid in our air. The stated aim of the Clean Air Strategy is to realise the full environmental and health benefits of cleaner air. And if we are to achieve this aim, the standards that are applied to air pollution must be measured in a way which is most closely related to its impact on human health. For this reason, the strategy should be redrafted to adopt World Health Organization guidelines by the end of 2022. The current commitment in the drafted strategy is to consider the adoption of World Health Organization guidelines by 2025, and this just isn't quite enough. It's important to remember, with respect to children in particular, that the health impacts of air pollution are proportionate to the amount of time spent living with it. Another generation of children cannot spend a large part of their childhood dealing with the consequences of air pollution, which can be lifelong for a child's health and cognitive development. As we all know, Ireland has famously been a laggard on climate action, but we can be progressive and a leader on air quality by joining both Austria and Sweden in adopting World Health Organization air quality standards. And we're so delighted today to be joined by air quality experts. Dr. Stig Hellebust, who is a lecturer in physical chemistry at University College Cork. He's been involved in research and in atmospheric chemistry and air pollution for over 15 years. As a postdoctoral researcher and lecturer in the UCC School of Chemistry, Tyndall National Institute and Aix-Marseille University, he's been involved in several projects on atmospheric particles, emission studies, atmospheric chemical processes, particle toxicity, public health, and indoor quality. He has an interest in field, lab, and modelling studies in atmospheric science, both indoor and outdoor. So Dr. Stig Hellebust is going to present to us on the science today, giving us an overview of air quality issues in Ireland. We're then going to hear from Dr. Orla Kelleher, who's teaching assistant in the University of Limerick. And Orla's PhD thesis examined the impact of climate change on legal reasoning in rights-based systemic climate change litigation in European countries. Dr. Kelleher is now researching air quality and human rights in UL and the governance of air quality in Ireland, and will present to us her research on air quality and the law today. And then finally, we are going to hear from Araceli Camargo, who is a lead scientist and co-founder of the UK's Centric lab, and a cognitive neuroscientist focused on how people interact with urban environments. Araceli is of Turtle Island descent and holds an MSc in cognitive neuroscience from King's College London. The Centric lab have been undertaking groundbreaking work in community collaboration by supporting communities in their right to health justice as they experience air pollution. So Araceli is going to speak to us about how we can engage with communities as we strive to achieve cleaner air across the island of Ireland. So I'm delighted now, Dr. Stig, to hand over to you. I'm going to turn off my screen share.
Yes, thank you very much, Clodagh. Thank you very much for inviting me. So, give me 5 seconds there. Right. Let's just start with the slideshow. There we go. Now, so again, thank you for attending and thank you for inviting me. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I have learned about air quality in Ireland in particular over the last few years. And I'll start out by saying that it is improved. It is so much better than it used to be, largely due to legislation. So I was not around here in Ireland in the 90s, but you can see from these pictures that things were worse than they are now. So just a little bit about myself and where I'm based. I'm working in the Centre for Research into Atmospheric Chemistry, and that is based in the School of Chemistry at University College Cork, and we're a group of professors and lecturers and postdocs and PhD students, and our director is Professor John Wenger, who was the co-founder of the centre in 1999 with Professor John Souther, who's now emeritus. And we do a lot of this kind of thing. We, if you see the picture here of the trailer, we often go out and we bring heavy equipment, lots of instrumentation, and we pack it into a trailer and we measure what's in the air. If you want to know more about us, you can visit our website there. And our work involves we work in mainly three arenas. It's the laboratory where we can isolate things and study chemical reactions, simulated atmospheres. But a lot of the time, we take our equipment out in the real world and measure what is there. And occasionally we have the luxury of sitting at our desk as well and do some modeling studies. And currently we are involved in a lot of exciting projects to look at different aspects of atmospheric chemistry. So we are interested in emissions from agriculture, from wildfires, from ships, from home heating, and we are interested in indoor air quality. We are also involved in a really exciting project, which is the top of the list there, which involves a lot of collaborators in materials chemistry and electronics and detection of atmospheric constituents. So all in all, we're working with a large number of partners, which is necessary when you are studying the atmosphere. So enough about us, but I'm going to talk about air pollution. What we mean by air pollution is when you have too much of something that shouldn't be there. And we largely can split that into two types of pollutants, and those are the gases and the aerosols. Gases are the ones that you probably all have heard of, the nitrogen oxides, the ozone, sulfur dioxide, and things like that. And they are emitted by natural and anthropogenic processes. But another very important group of pollutants are the aerosols or particulate matter. But all of these pollutants, they have impacts on the climate, on the environment, and on our health. And for that reason, there is a national monitoring network which is operated by the Irish Environmental Protection Agency, and this is designed to keep track of Ireland's compliance with the air quality standards. So currently there are roughly 100 monitoring locations in Ireland, and it's divided into 4 air quality zones. And those zones are Dublin, Cork, and a number of other large towns. And then there's Zone D, which is rural Ireland. And that is all the part of that map that is yellow. That is Zone D. But what's important about this is that this network is designed to monitor compliance with air quality standards. And in order to do that, we have to make sure that the measurements comply with data quality standards. And this is an important point which becomes very relevant these days when there's a development of a lot of low-cost sensor networks, which are very useful, very interesting, and empower communities to keep track of the air in their communities. But we have to remember that there is a difference in accuracy. In Cork, for example, we've got 4 reference stations. In Dublin, there's a good few more. One of the ones in Cork is operated by us, and it was opened in 2018. And it's one of the reference stations on the EPA network. And public information in Ireland on air quality is available on the airquality.ie website. I showed the link there a minute ago. And that is updated hourly. So most people will be able to check the air quality in their area, or at least in their zone at any one time. But I'm going to talk about particulate matter because I think it's often forgotten. And the issue with the particulate matter is that the legislation is blind to the toxicity of it. It deals with the amount of it. And if we look at one particle, we can imagine the figure on the left being one particle. And if we look at the images here in the middle, those are images of individual particles taken from an electron microscope. What I want to point out here is that they are all different. So a particle is not just a particle. But if you take a collection of particles, you end up with something like we have here on the right, a filter. And what matters to the legislation is what's on that, the amount of particles on that filter, not what they are made of. And this is really important to the health impacts. We also split it into sizes. So we can say that the smaller particles, they go deeper into the lungs, and that makes them more of a health problem. And for monitoring purposes, they are divided into PM10 and PM2.5. PM10 means particulate matter that are smaller than 10 micrometer in diameter, and PM2.5 then are particles that are smaller than 2.5 micrometer, or we can call it coarse and fine. But the reason for this division is to do with how deeply into the respiratory system they can go. And if this is interesting to people and if they want to learn more about it, the best source I can recommend is a book called The Invisible Killer, which is the most readable, entertaining, and interesting text I have read on the subject as a non-scientific textbook. It's a very good source of information, and there's a lot of interesting history as well. And just to say, I have no stake in the sales of the book, but it is a really good book. So I'm going to make one more point about the chemical compositions of particles, because like we know, there are many sources of particles. There's natural ones, there's man-made ones. What happens in the atmosphere, of course, is that all of this mixes together. And what we experience when we are living and breathing is the mixture of the particles from all of these different sources. And that is also what you can obtain when you take a sample. And unfortunately, the different sources of particles, they don't organize themselves in different sections on that filter. But what we can do is, of course, to analyze the chemical composition of the particle collection, and that, of course, is useful, and that's easy because we can get chemical composition of anything. But that does not tell us what we really need to know. What we really need to know is not what is in it, but where is it coming from. So we need to reorganize that information that we get from the chemical analysis into something like this, which doesn't tell us what is on that filter, but where it came from. And that is possible. We can do that with methods that have been developed by a number of researchers. And when you have that kind of information, that means you can actually do something about the problem. Because now you can say, you can say, I need to reduce the biggest chunk of this, the biggest slice of this pie. That's what I have to start working on in order to improve the air quality. This pie that I'm showing you now is just a fictitious example. It's not based on any measurements, but we have done measurements, and we looked at several small towns in Ireland in a project called Sapphire, which was led by Professor Wenger, and you can read the report from that project from the EPA website, if you like. But the outcome of that was that the majority of the particulate pollution in any of the small towns that we looked at is from solid fuel burning. The biggest source of pollution in small town Ireland and rural Ireland is home heating. It's not traffic. And we could go one step further, and we could also look at what are the fuels that people are burning and determine what is the contribution to the pollution of the different fuels. So there is in Ireland an unusual mixture in that we have coal and we have peat and we have wood, and on the continent there is a lot of dominance of wood. So this was based on a lot of measurements, and we could say that these are the relative amount of sources in small town. And let me show you a figure here which it shows the differences in particulate matter levels in areas of Cork City and region. And there's two things you can notice from this figure. This is from 0 to 24 hours, so it's basically one day, but it's an average day, averaged over a few months. So this is a typical cycle in Cork from morning to evening, and we see that there is a small bulge around sort of 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, and then there is a bigger pollution event that takes place around 7 or 8 o'clock. So there is more pollution in the evening than there is in the morning. And again, that makes sense if we think that the main source of pollution is from home heating, because that is when people are at home lighting their fires and their stoves. But if you look at the on the right, the 4 different lines there. There is the one that is green, and there's the one that is red. And the interesting thing here is that the lowest level is measured in the city, whereas the highest level in the evening is measured in a small town outside the city. So we know a lot about air pollution, where it's coming from, and what the main sources are, but we know maybe less about what impact it has on health. So I'm going to just say a few words about the project that we are working on, called Inhale, which is just completed. This is led by Dr. Eilish O'Reilly at the School of Public Health at UCC, and it's also funded by the EPA. But this project is looking at how air quality affects our health, but not just how air quality affects our health, because we know a lot about that already. But the problem is, how can we know what effect it has on our health? Because it all depends on exposure. It depends on what people are breathing. So we measure air quality in one location, but we don't know what people are breathing if they live, say, 10, 20 kilometers away from that location. And the difficulty with linking up this information is to do with spatial distribution. So I've said determining the chemistry of the pollution, that's the easy part. What's difficult is to know what people have actually been exposed to. And the reason this is difficult, part of the reason this is difficult is, of course, that for good reason, health outcomes, information on health outcomes for people is protected by privacy legislation. So of course, it's not available to everybody, but it does make this situation difficult to assess, because we need to be able to say what people have been exposed to if they have experienced health problems related to breathing bad air. So this is the problem that the Inhale project is trying to tackle. And if you look at the map, like I said, there is a good network of air quality monitoring, but it cannot cover every square inch of the country. You can only measure in a limited number of locations, whereas people live everywhere. And when people get sick, they go to hospital, they have a health record. That health record is not available to people who want to study the effects of air quality. So they operate with aggregates. They look at things like, what is the rate of heart disease by county, or what is the rate of respiratory problems by county. And air quality cannot be averaged by county, because it is much more localized than that. So when we do air quality monitoring in one place and people live in another place, we don't actually have information that can link up those two data sets, so that we can prove statistically or otherwise what effect air quality actually has on health. So the solution to that is very complicated, but we will make a recommendation in our final report, which I don't want to preempt, because we need to work to submit that first, but I can take questions. How am I doing for time?
Yeah, you're absolutely fine. If you want to take another 2 minutes or so, that would be perfect. And then we'll hand over to Orla.
Right,
Thanks.
because I mentioned the low-cost sensors for community measurements, and these are gaining ground all over the world, because they are aimed at the consumer market, and they're small, they're cheap, anybody can buy them, put them up outside their house. And there is great value in that, but what's important to remember is that they have issues with accuracy of the measurements. However, they can be very useful if you put them in a network. As long as we are aware that they do not comply with data quality standards of the reference stations. They do provide some useful information, most notably if you have them in a network in a city. You can look at air quality in different parts of that city, and that can be very useful for people who are going out at night deciding where to go for a run or cycle. Let's avoid the worst affected areas right now. And Cork City Council have been very proactive in this regard, and developed a dashboard, which we are also collaborating with them on, so that citizens of Cork can actually do this. They can look up the local air quality in Cork City at any time. We just have to bear in mind that these are not reference monitors. This is not for legislation. This is for information. And that means that we can look at different parts of the city, and there are differences. And this is maybe where we can make changes, because you can change things, how the traffic flows, you can change things to do with the heating schemes and things like that. But what is also interesting from doing that is that we can see that the worst affected areas are not where all the traffic is. It's actually where people live, because a lot of the emissions are from people's homes. When we're talking about particulate matter, with NO2, it's a different story. And we again, same thing I showed you before, we have a peak in the evening. I think I will leave it there. I will be back for questions after 4.
Thanks very much, Stig. That was so informative. And there was a request in from the chat box to provide the name of the book that you recommended. And if you wouldn't mind typing in the name of that book into the chat.
It's called.
That's great.
It's called The Invisible Killer by Gary Fuller. Gary Fuller is a scientist working in.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for that. That was so comprehensive. Thank you.
Oh, apologies, but I have to leave, but I will come back.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Orla, we're going to hand over to you now. So Dr. Orla Kelleher of University College Limerick, who's going to speak about air quality and the law in Ireland.
Thanks very much, Coda. I'm just going to try share my slides.
Perfect, yeah.
Bear with me a second. Nice. I hope everybody can see those okay. So I'm going to talk today about how, I suppose, air quality is governed in Ireland. So as an environmental and human rights lawyer, naturally, if my slides will cooperate with me. Oh, here we go. Sorry, I am going to try to give it a little bit of a human rights framing. So in this particular space, there has been a lot of contributions from the human rights community already. So in particular, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment wrote a very important report in 2019 on clean air and human rights. And I think it's useful maybe to highlight a few points from that report to give us a useful benchmark, I think, to assess the actions that are already being taken both at the European level and at the Irish level on air quality. So just to maybe pull out a few quotes. So from the report, it says that poor air quality has implications for a wide range of human rights, including the right to life, health, water, food, housing, and adequate standards of living, as well as the right to a healthy and sustainable environment itself. It highlights how states have procedural, substantive, and special obligations to vulnerable persons in the context of air quality. So what we mean by that is states have obligations, for example, to provide adequate environmental information, to facilitate public participation, to ensure access to justice is affordable and timely, but also other things like promoting education and awareness around air quality. And then when we talk about substantive obligations, what we mean by that is that states shouldn't violate the right to breathe clean air themselves through their own actions, but also they need to protect protect citizens against the actions of third parties that might contribute to pollution, such as businesses, and should establish, implement and enforce existing laws, policies and programs on air quality. So I think it's useful, I think, to pull this third point out about a particular obligation that the UN Special Rapporteur highlighted was the obligation, or rather the recommendation, that states should establish air quality legislation that incorporates the WHO guidelines as legally binding national standards. So that's something I'll come back and talk about again at the end. But I think it's important to highlight that, I suppose, a human rights compliant approach would make the WHO guidelines legally binding national standards. Additionally, the report highlights the importance, as I say, of effective enforcement of existing environmental standards in relation to air quality, and the idea of non-regression. So really important that states don't backslide at particular times in terms of air quality, that you don't weaken air quality regulations or standards where there's maybe a change of government or a change of particular circumstances, that we are always, I suppose, progressing our approach to air quality. So what I want to do for the remainder of the presentation is to talk about the legislative framework. So how is air quality governed in Ireland at the EU level? And then briefly, I'm going to touch on the national level. So what national legislation do we have in place to deal with air quality issues? So when we talk about the EU level, so Ireland is a member of the European Union. So as part of our membership, we have to abide by air quality standards set in Europe. And since the 1980s, the EU has introduced various directives. So those are pieces of law that require a particular outcome on emissions and on what are called ambient air quality concentrations. So how much of a particular pollutant can we find in the air? And when we're talking about pollutants, really we're talking about I suppose concentrations that may be harmful to human health. So the two pieces of legislation that we're going to be talking about are the ambient air quality directives and the national emission commitments directives. So as I say, the national emissions commitments directive is all about setting and capping the total level of pollutants that can be emitted by any member state in a given year. And the ambient air quality directives then are about the actual concentration of a particular pollutant that can occur in the air. So the two of those sort of join together, if you like, to form the bedrock really of air quality law at the European level. So I'm going to look at those both in a little bit more detail. So firstly, that national emissions reduction commitment directive, so a bit of a mouthful. So that is in its second iteration now. This particular directive came into force at the end of 2016. So it sets binding targets for 2020 and 2030 on reducing emissions for things like nitrous oxide, which was talked about in the previous presentation briefly, which come from traffic, or mostly come from traffic, non-methane volatile organic compounds, sulfur dioxide, ammonia, and fine particulate matter, which we talked about a little bit in the previous presentation as well. So the idea behind these commitments is that we reduce the health impacts of air pollution. And there's a particular target to reduce them in half relative to 2005 levels by 2030. So quite significant those aims about what we want to achieve there. So the directive itself sets out a particular objective about achieving levels of air quality that do not pose a significant negative impact on or risk to human health and the environment. So there's a particular obligation on all states, including Ireland, to draw up what are called national air pollution control programs to limit emissions and to, I suppose, try to stop to contribute towards achieving this this objective. So you can see here the various commitments that Ireland has signed up to for the 2020 period and right up to 2030. So we have to reduce emissions in these particular particular pollutants in that period. So we've been doing quite well on a lot of pollutants, but one that we've really struggled on is ammonia. I want to talk about that a little bit going forward, but in brief, that the main contributor for ammonia is agriculture and in particular things like synthetic fertilizers and I suppose intensification of agriculture. So in terms of, so these are directives. So what that means in very simple terms is that the EU sets out an aim for all the member states, and then it's up to the member states to actually implement it at the national level. So there has to be some kind of legislation at the national level to give effect to that. So in Ireland, there are 2018 regulations doing just that. So they set a very important role for the Environmental Protection Agency. So the EPA has to prepare annual inventories in these reports on the 5 main pollutants, and in certain years has to look at what the projected emissions are going to be for that field. Importantly, the regulations impose a particular obligation on the Minister for Environment, Climate and Communication to ensure that the emission ceilings, that the emissions of those 5 pollutants are limited in accordance with the law. So there's a particular obligation on the Minister to achieve that. And as part of that, there's a requirement on each member state to prepare these national air pollution control programs and to establish monitoring networks, which we talked about, to monitor the negative impacts of air quality or air pollution. So as I already said, a particular issue for Ireland is non-compliance with this directive in relation to ammonia. So the EPA in its own reports has indicated that 7 out of the last 9 years, we have been in non-compliance when it's come to ammonia emissions. Now there is plans set out for how we can achieve our targets, which interestingly are on the lower end relative to other European countries in terms of ammonia targets, but we would have to fully implement all of those measures to achieve this. So a particular challenge there in terms of dealing with ammonia emissions. So the next directive I wanted to talk about is the Ambient Air Quality and Clean Air for Europe directive. So sometimes you might hear that referred to as the CAFE directive, or you'll hear it referred to as different things. I'm just going to refer to it as the Ambient Air Quality directive. So in terms of the objectives set out in that directive, so they set out objectives for ambient air quality designed to avoid, prevent and reduce the harmful effects on human health and the environment as a whole. And also there's an aim to assess the ambient air quality in the member states on the basis of common methods and criteria. So the idea of having a directive like this is that we can compare in Limerick, in Dublin, in Cork, in Paris, in Ljubljana and Berlin, all the different air quality, and we know that we're using the same standards between the different cities and different places across Europe. So it sets limits. So it sets limit values or target values for things like sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, carbon monoxide, benzene, ozone and particulate matter, which we've talked about being really important because of its particular risks, because of the particular risks it poses to human health. So there are various obligations under the directive. So member states have to divide their countries into zones. So that was something we talked about in the last presentation about the different zones around Ireland. And within those zones, there's requirements to monitor the air quality. So there's requirements that the air quality quality monitoring going on in each of those zones is done by the various criteria set out in the directive. And very importantly, there's a requirement on member states that all of the sampling stations, that they're located in such a way that they're providing data on the areas within the zones where the highest concentrations of particular pollutants are occurring. So we want to get a really good picture of I suppose, where the worst pollution is happening. And then there's a really important obligation on member states, so Ireland included, to ensure that the ambient air quality itself doesn't exceed the concentration or limit value. And then if there is an exceedance, that member states have to set up these air quality plans, which will set out proper, appropriate measures so that that exceedance period, so that the spike in pollutants can be kept as short as possible. So those are quite extensive obligations on member states, and we've had a particularly supportive European Court of Justice on the directive. So the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg is responsible for enforcing EU law and has been quite a champion, I suppose, of air quality. So I've just highlighted a few of the cases that have happened in this space over the years. So the Janacek case was one of the earliest cases, and in that case it was established that where there's a risk that there's going to be an exceedance of these values, so there's going to be higher pollution than is allowed by the directive, the persons concerned should be in a position to require the competent authority to draw up an action plan to address the issue. So they have the right of standing to go to court. They have the right to a remedy. So the remedy being an action plan of how you're going to tackle it, and the courts will actually review it. So really significant rights there. So in Commission in Italy then, a very interesting case where the court basically said that things like technical or financial or administrative difficulties in trying to achieve these targets is not a good excuse. Adhering to these limit values are absolute duties on the member states. So again, the courts are being very supportive of ensuring, I suppose, the effectiveness of this directive. Then Client Earth, who's been one of the most active NGOs in this space, has had a number of very successful cases before the European Court. And one I want to highlight here is from 2014. And in that case, it was said that where there's an exceedance, where we have one of these issues of too much pollutant getting into the air, national courts have to have the powers to order the competent authority to draw up compliant air quality plans. And while there might be a level of discretion as to what that will include, ultimately the exceedance period has to be kept as short as possible. And finally, the Cranes case then, so really significant again, allowing citizens to challenge the quality and adequacy of the monitoring networks to ensure that they're in compliance with what's required of the directive. And ultimately in that case, the court made clear that the objectives of the directive itself, so protecting human health, would be undermined if the sampling points weren't being located in areas with the highest possible concentration, the highest levels of concentration. So again, we've had a court so far that's been really supportive of ensuring that European citizens enjoy a high quality of high standards of air quality. So I think it's interesting just to highlight for people, given this will be my kind of main recommendation at the end, that at present the standards required by the directive still don't actually live up to the World Health Organization guidelines. So based on the older World Health Organization guidelines, we had disparities between, say, the levels of PM 2.5 that you could be exposed to, so much higher amounts of pollution being allowed under EU law than what the World Health Organization was recommending. similar issues for things like ozone. So I think already the directive was behind the World Health Organization guidelines. And since 2021, we now have these new targets from the World Health Organization. So these new guidelines mean that European law is even more behind, I suppose, what the World Health Organization is telling us are safe levels of pollution. So now we have NO2 emissions, which would come predominantly from things like transport being 4 times higher than what is recommended by the World Health Organization, and the legal limits of PM 2.5 being 5 times higher. So at this particular moment in time, the EU standards are not in line with the World Health Organization's guidelines as to what is actually safe. So the good news is that as part of the European Green Deal, the European Commission has adopted what is called a zero pollution action plan for air, soil and water. And the key vision behind it is that by 2050, pollution will be reduced to levels that are no longer considered harmful to health and natural ecosystems. And as part of that, they've set an important 2030 target of reducing by more than 50% the health impacts caused by air quality. And one of the most important commitments there is a commitment to revise the targets in the Ambient Air Quality Directive. So they are committing to aligning themselves more with the recommendations of the World Health Organization. So that's a very active space at the minute. We are expecting that there will be a legislative proposal in the second half of 2022. So ultimately, EU law is about to change in this space and move far more towards what the World Health Organization recommends. And there's a really strong push at the European level to ensure that those would be binding legal limits rather than aspirational objectives. So that is kind of what the picture looks like at the European level. At present, again, because it's a directive, it has to be transposed. So we have to have an Irish piece of legislation that connects this into Irish law. And so what we have are the 2011 regulations. So again, they'll set out the various limit values in this space. And the EPA, again, has a very important role in implementing these regulations and the directive under Irish law, and has to do these annual reports on ambient air quality. So interesting to note that there hasn't been exceedances in 2020 of the EU's legal limit values, but that's not the full picture, because there have been several exceedances of the World Health Organization's guidelines. So those are the older guidelines. So as I say, they've gotten much stricter now. So I think it's fair to assume that when we see this report for 2021 with the new World Health Organization guidelines, the level of exceedances is potentially going to be even higher. So I think that gives maybe a little bit of a picture as to what the EU standard is, where the WHO is advising we are, and kind of what the ground to travel in between. So as I said, I wanted to touch briefly on national legislation. So we do have what's called the Air Pollution Act of 1987. So it's quite an old piece of legislation now. It's the framework legislation for controlling it's for controlling and licensing air emissions. So it's really the empowering legislation, if you like, that gives the minister power to make various regulations in relation to air quality. So things like making regulations like the smoky coal ban. So at the minute, we have a smoky coal ban that operates in all towns where there's a population of over 10,000. A positive innovation is that from September 2022, there will be new solid fuel standards are introduced across the country. So not just where there's where there's populations in excess of 10,000, but this legislation is up for review. And so I think it's a really, really important opportunity for us to try shape it in I suppose for a way that's fit for the 21st century. So I suppose my key recommendation for the Ireland's Clean Air Strategy and for the Air Pollution Act is that we start to align ourselves much more closely with the 2021 WHO guidelines. So I think a really important place to start would be replacing the existing Air Pollution Act with a new Clean Air Act and making the World Health Organization's guidelines legally binding standards. So I'm not alone in calling for this. There was an excellent report done last year by the UCC Environmental Law Clinic on regulating smoky coal, which made a similar call. Equally, Pliant Earth, who are a leading NGO in this space, have been calling for the WHO's 2021 guidelines to become legally binding standards at the European level as well. So like Clodagh, I would agree that the consultation's proposal to just take into consideration these guidelines by 2025 is simply not enough in my view, and I think we should be aiming for far better. This, as I've kind of highlighted already, it's coming down the tracks at the EU level anyway, and I think Ireland has a unique opportunity now to champion this and to lead on this rather than, I suppose, to be a laggard or to follow. So I think a really important place to start, and what I would be encouraging people to do in the context of making a submission, is to really push for incorporating the World Health Organization's guidelines into Ireland's Clean Air Strategy and into our new Clean Air Act. So I'll leave it there. I'll be here for questions if anyone wants to raise anything at the end, and I'll hand back over to you, Clodagh.
Thanks so much, Orla, for such a detailed overview of air quality governance in Ireland, at the EU, and then the international level as well. That was brilliant. Thanks so much. So the benefit of having online events is that we're able to invite guests from overseas. And so we're so delighted to be joined, as mentioned at the start, by Araceli Camargo, who is lead scientist and co-founder of the UK Centric Lab. And so Araceli is going to speak to us now about how we can engage communities as we strive for cleaner air across Ireland. So I'll pass over to you now.
Hi, I'm Araceli. I'm sorry, I have a cold. So my nose and my voice might be a little bit bunged off, and also my brain is working at a very low speed. So because of the timings, I think it would maybe be a better format to look at 10 observations that y'all can contemplate and think about, and how that relates to both the phenomena that we're living through and then how that relates to communities. So the first is there is a cognitive and sociocultural difference between asking for clean air and asking for cleaner air. Cleaner air denotes a permission to still pollute at a certain level, whereas communities are asking for clean air, i.e. no pollution. So how do those two things get matched up? Secondly, there is no safe levels of air pollution, none at all. This is not only coming from a neuroepidemiological perspective, but it is also now something that the WHO has explicitly said. Furthermore, this is not under any policy or law just yet. The next point is that air pollution is very insidious because it affects us via two distinct pathways. The first one is that through the inhalation of the particles, it gets into our bloodstream. And once it gets into our bloodstream, it means it can affect every single organ because the blood runs through every single tissue, thus affecting organ. Of course, for pregnant people, that is even more of a worry because we are now creating life and starting life under an umbrella of contamination. So all those later diseases that we see or that we correlate with old age, such as dementia or Parkinson's, etc., those conversations need to be started further back into what does the womb environment look like, where is the womb environment located, and starting to have those conversations between policy, communities, and health practitioners. The next thing to contemplate is, the idea of adaptation. So we hear that word a lot when it comes to either the climate crisis or when it comes to looking at the future, right? We have to adapt to X, we have to adapt to Y. Adaptation, technically, its roots are biological. So how our bodies and biological systems adapt to their environment. And in a natural evolutionary timescape, but also in a natural set of circumstances. So you are adapting slowly to, say, a very cold environment or to a very hot environment. But you are also given all the resources and recourses you need to be able to do that. At the moment, we're taking them all away. We're taking the very building blocks for us to be able to adapt. And that is coming through contaminants like air pollution. So air pollution is not just the contamination directly to our bodies, it's also contaminating our water, our soil, our food that we're consuming. So we're not going to be able to adapt. And also we have to ask then a ethical question of why would we ask society to adapt to harm? So the more logical thing is to remove harm rather than ask people to adapt to harm. And that, I think, is another set of lexicons or vocabulary that is A, coming from communities, but also B, where the law is still very much lagging behind. And then we also have to look at the way air pollution contributes to the phenomena of planetary deregulation. At Centric, we don't usually talk about the climate crisis or climate change, because it's an output, it's not an input, and you can't solve outputs, you have to solve inputs. And it doesn't allow us to really frame exactly what the phenomena is, and it often gaslights communities that are living a crisis in very real time and in much shorter time spans. So air pollution, as I said, contaminates so much of land, water, soil. Therefore, it's changing the microbiome, the consistency of our lands. And that is going to affect biodiversity, right? If you can't have a soil that is rich, that is nourishing, because it's full of contaminants and it's killing the biodiversity, you can just see again in those building blocks how if biodiversity cannot grow, we cannot get the other parts of the ecosystem that give us the stabilizers to operate in their rhythms, which is a whole other type of scientific study, that the rhythms of our planet are off and they're starting at those building blocks. So when people in communities are asking for clean air, it is a direct ask, to asking for a very fundamental building block to get solved. The other thing to contemplate is that we should be moving from, in speaking about not the individual and what can communities do, right? Because communities, they are fighting for justice, they are creating various types of solutions, but again, it's the adaptation side of it, which, as we already said, there is an ethical issue there. We're asking people to adapt to harm, but we're not asking industry and the systems to change, right? We're not having a conversation about how capitalism is putting us in this peril. Because if we don't have that conversation, what we're going to do is go into the next part, which is electrification, because we're taking the fossil fuels and some of the pollution down, not all. But we're still going into an extractive economies, which is still going to contaminate, and we really can't afford that. We just cannot afford to rely or to deplete Mother Nature in that way. So first of all, identifying the big polluters, the big industry polluters, holding them accountable, understanding that ecosystem, who are they funding? Because also these big polluters will fund, ironically, charities that have to do with clean air. They will fund organizations, as in the fossil fuel companies are involved in organizations like the Wellcome Trust. The Wellcome Trust puts billions of pounds of investment into, not that they receive, into fossil fuels. And then they want to turn around and fund research on cancer, on depression, on anxiety, whilst willfully adding to the problem. So when we look at the ecosystem, when we look at the way that the systems are being funded and being run, that is where our energy needs to focus. And how do we create policies that support that, whilst not gaslighting the communities? Because what I see a lot is that the communities get put into this almost like a hamster wheel, or they go around and around in circles because they are told you can't do that because the policy protects the corporation, and therefore agencies like the environmental agency, they can't do anything about it. And so you just have communities just, what do you call it, speaking into the void and not getting any traction. So we have to, again, how do we support that in an ecosystemic way? The next thing to contemplate is that air pollution doesn't happen as a singular phenomena. Usually when you have air pollution, for example, if air pollution is coming from a landfill site, you're also going to have noise pollution because of the delivery, of a truck, or the mechanics of filling up the landfill site, right? There's a lot of industrial noise that comes from the landfill site, but you're also, excuse me, you're also going to have the surrounding waterways completely contaminated from a landfill site like that. You're also going to have the land that is contaminated and no longer available for any type of biodiversity consumption. But finally, you're also going to have noise, right? Sorry, we already talked about the noise. But finally, you're also going to have the inability of people to be able to engage with their surroundings. So say a landfill site is next to a park, which often does happen. Then we're telling communities to look out for their health, or to diminish their contribution to air pollution by doing active travel. But we're also forcing them to walk right next to a landfill site that is giving out, that's the last, an olfactory factor that can be very debilitating. And it's also, we never talk about the trauma of experiencing the inequity, right? That you know that you're being harmed. You can see your neighbors, your friends, your family being harmed by this entity, by this phenomena. And that also drains and has a mental burden in that experience. And so when we were talking about, again, the relationship between air pollution, you have to think about it in its full systemic phenomena that it is the physiological situation that is happening, but it's also the mental burden from the community experiencing, and then asking for help and being denied, and then going through the gaslighting process. All of it, which contributes to malaise. We have done a couple of bits of research of how communities that go through this process can end up with things like anxiety, depression, and PTSD, just from the experience of asking for help, going through the environmental justice process, which again, it's something that we don't really talk about. And then going a little bit more macro, looking at how this begins to affect at an even bigger ecosystem, we should be talking about land stewardship. So John Locke in the 1800s, an Englishman, he went over to my side, to Turtle Island, and said to my people, this land is not being productive. The people on this land are not making the best of the land, when idiotically he didn't understand that we had medicines, we had ability to create shelter and care for our people, and all our ecosystems were in health, including that of humans. And so he thought it was his, words not mine, his sovereign right to dominate not just people, but also land. But prior to that, that happened here, or I should say within the Isles of the United Kingdom and Ireland, where when feudalism existed, that was the apex that started the intersection that started disease, where land ownership came in with forced labor. And by forced labor, yes, you're getting paid, but you're being forced because you have no other choice. Your land has been taken. You can't live off the land in any shape or form. You now have to go into the labor force. And when you have a labor force that is living in really bad conditions next to animals and land that are also in a bad condition, the land and animal gut biome and immunity goes down. There goes the rise for plagues. And there is a lot of research in that area of how those two things come together, and that continues to this day. So when we're thinking again about air pollution, is who owns that land? That is a very important question, because whoever owns that land is using it for productivity, which means that, again, the landfill site has to continue to run because somebody's making money out of it. And when you're looking at it from then a migratory process, I can speak about it very much in terms of Turtle Island in the Americas, is that a lot of further south, and what is called by indigenous people as Abayala, they are being taken from their land for fossil fuel. So this is a very specific example from Ecuadorian Amazon. Their lands not necessarily taken, but they're being extracted on, which makes them unlivable. Land, water, soil contaminated by the extraction of fossil fuels. They're getting sick. They can no longer live off the land. They have to move, and then move up north to where capitalism lives, because that's where they have been told they will be able to survive. And so that crisis that we're seeing of indigenous migration north, which by the way is their right, because all of it is their lands, is being, again, back to that root cause of contamination. So that's it. I'm going to leave it there. And if anybody has any questions, I will be hanging around.
Thank you so much, Araceli, for really broadening out the conversation and bringing in the issue of structures and systems and capitalism in particular. And I think that links back quite nicely to the point we were making at the start about not individualizing this problem, particularly because issues like fuel poverty are just being so experienced across Ireland. So we're going to open up now to a Q&A session. If anybody would like to ask our speakers questions from their presentations. Or if any of the participants would like to ask each other a question, any of the panelists. Araceli, as we have you here, would you mind speaking to us about one example of a case where the Centric lab has collaborated with a community who is experiencing air pollution?
Yeah, we do it. We have quite a few now that we're in collaboration with. And what I mean by collaboration is that we are working together. So it's not as if they are subjects of research, nor are we doing this top-down investigation. It's that we have a bidirectional communication systems. Like, for example, we are part of a WhatsApp group with a group down in Lee Valley, which is where there's going to be a brownfield site built up. So at the moment, we have been advising them from the very beginning of, this is what's going to happen. These are the things that you're going to have to look out for. Looking at how they're building their brand and their website, because there are other communities that are experiencing the same phenomena. So the hope is that those nodes will soon begin to join up into a network, because like I said, the gaslighting is incredibly severe, where they are constantly being told that, even to the point of, that really bad smell that you're smelling is actually not, it's not that bad. Because they use some sort of metric that gauges odor, and they're like, but we live with this every single day, and that's the thing that they don't take into account. Smelling the odor maybe once for 30 minutes may be tolerable, but when you're doing this every day, it stacks up. So with them, our next step now is that we're reading through the legal documents that they have been sent, so we can start extracting the language of health, of how it is that how their health is going to be affected, because that's the crux of it, right? If the community goes, we're experiencing these poor health outcomes, and the whole system tells them, no, you're not. There's a whole bunch of reasons you can be getting sick, which is correct, but likely it's also related to this new air pollution site. And so that's one that is in the process. So the construction has not started, but historically we have worked with Southall, which is in South London, where we created a report to explain that health phenomena they were experiencing, everything from the trauma that they were going through, but also their vulnerability as a community to air pollution, because again, the WHO again is very explicit. It says these are guidelines, do your community work. It tells you in that platform, right? You have to go and look and study the community and see if that recommendation is suited for that community. No one does that homework. Everyone's like, well, it's under the WHO requirement, or we're adhering at the WHO requirement. Therefore, it means that health is okay. And I would say that that's probably another point to look at, is that we're using apples to measure pears, right? So we're saying, okay, so because the measurement is at X, it means that health is at Y. That's not correct. You can't use one metric to measure one phenomena to tell you about another phenomena. Like, that is scientifically implausible, also logically implausible. But yet that's happening. And so calling for specific health assessments, which is what we ended up doing at Southall, is giving them their specific health assessment to go, this community is incredibly vulnerable because they're shift workers. And this is what happens to a body that's doing shift work. They're also a community that is highly deprived. So already the body is incredibly depleted. So a body that's depleted under very small amounts of air pollution can experience very high poor health outcomes, such as an asthma attack, or the asthma can evolve very quickly. And we're not having these nuances in these conversations. So that's been what we've been with Southall for 3 years now, and just iteratively working with them. First was a rapport, but then we'll show up to a webinar, we'll show up to a town hall meeting. We have showed up to talk to their MP. It's just wherever they need us to back them up when it comes to health, that's what we do.
Thank you so much. It's such a great model. There is a question that has come in from Alan, which I think is for you, Stig, if that's okay. He says, I'd be interested in getting better access to historic data on air quality and weather. Does the CRAC lab have better historic air data? And is this something that could be improved through the consultation process?
Well, the historic air quality data from the National Air Quality Monitoring Network is all publicly available, going back to the first measurement that was made in Rathmines in 1988, I think, when they started measuring nitrogen oxide. The problem is that it's actually very hard to find, but it is there on the EPA website, and it's called the SAFER database. And you might have to do a search for EPA SAFER. I just did that, and I can put that in the chat, but it seems like the actual website is down at the minute. But you can download all the historic data from there. And if you're looking for recent data, you can go to the airquality.ie. And from there, you can get the hourly updated values as well. So nothing is measured that isn't available. Everything is available, but you could argue that the website is a little bit hard to navigate, but it is there. And for the Met Éireann, you can get a historical weather data as well, met.ie, and they have historical. Another source for that is data.gov.ie, which I will put there in the, this is a very good source of data as well. So yeah, no, I noticed there in question that Alan is looking to predict air quality from weather inputs, and that's very interesting. We've actually done some of that ourselves, because in connection with the COVID, the lockdowns and that, we used weather normalization to predict the impact of the lockdowns. So there is definitely a lot of interesting work that can be done there, linking those two data sets, but they are all available. Everything we do, everything we measure is all all publicly funded as well. So all our data is also available from, well, either directly from us after the end of a project or from the EPA Safer database. So, and please get in touch if there's any more questions about data sources. I can try to help.
Great, thanks, Stig. So there's two more questions that have come in. One is for Orla. So that's if Ireland does adopt WHO guidelines, which isn't like, it's not a panacea, but if Ireland were to adopt WHO guidelines as legally binding targets, what year do you think, Orla, the government could realistically aim for to do that? That's from Mark Murphy. Sorry.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think ultimately, I would argue it's sort of a matter of political choice. So we pick these targets based on kind of what we perceive to be feasible, but it's really how much transformative action we want to commit to. So, I mean, I would argue anyway, as a wealthy country that actually claims to have quite good air quality standards already, we should be pushing for much sooner than that. I mean, it really is a question of how, you know, committed we are to transformative action. So I would personally be of the view that it should be sooner than 2025 or 2030. And I think, as I say, that the review of the national legislation is, to my mind, a very good opportunity to do it. So I would be suggesting sooner than that. I mean, I think ultimately it's a question of political will and whether you want to put resources behind it. And if you're, I suppose, interested in going for that transformative change or not. So that would be sort of my 2 cents.
Thanks, Orla. And then the final question that's come in is from Kevin, who says, would love to hear the Irish panelists' response to Araceli's input. How do we tie air pollution activism and intervention to the crisis of capital in explicit terms? Any ideas on this that have occurred to you while listening? Either Stig or Orla.
I'm happy to hop in, and I think kind of as a starting point, really, it's kind of coming back to something you had mentioned earlier, Claude, about sort of structural change and transformative change and the commitment to that. So, you know, when it comes to, I suppose, our approach to the to Ireland's clean air strategy, when it comes to how we proceed, I suppose I often think in legal terms, but with our EU directives, and we proceed with our national legislation, are we interested in transformative change that is structural, or are we interested in individualizing it as an issue? And I think ultimately the way maybe to give voice to that, I would think, is to support the structural change. One thing I was really struck with when I was reading the Clean Air Strategy was the use of the language of just transition, but I wasn't necessarily convinced in how the government is proposing to give effect to it that it actually is representing just transition. So, for example, the 2022 new standards in terms of solid fuel, there's a reluctance to engage with, I suppose, dealing with existing turbary rights and cutting turf. And while that is obviously an acknowledgement of particular reliance that exists around the country on, say, families that will use solid fuels to heat their homes, I think ultimately it seems to be a bit of a cop-out that there's not a move, or there's no vision going further than that, I think, in terms of how we're actually going to help those communities to transition in a way that's not going to push them into fuel poverty, while also acknowledging, I suppose, the air quality issues that go hand in hand with continuing to use solid fuels. So I think it's, to my mind, kind of hopefully focusing on the structural and transformative changes rather than on individual actions in the Clean Air Strategy.
Great, thanks, Orla. And I see Araceli has raised a hand there.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the idea of data in communities. So number one, we have to acknowledge what data are. They are numbers without meaning, right? We give them meaning, and communities shouldn't be having to do that heavy lifting. First of all, data should be open to everybody. That's very much part of justice, or health, environmental justice. But two, giving them that extra, what do you do with this? Or how do you read this? How is it contextualized to you? And then thirdly, allowing them to collect their own data, but also allowing the pathways and avenues to acknowledge that their data is as valid as everybody else's, because it's the in real time phenomena that is important. We no longer need data to understand how air pollution affects us. We know that. Nor do we need air pollution data to tell us when we're having a bad AP day. Like, we know that. We can sense it, we can feel it. And arguably, we don't even necessarily need it to make a legal argument. What we need is for when these communities are going, look, we had 3 or 4 people being sent to the hospital, which is what's happening. And then they want to go and read, well, what was happening weather-wise, what was happening with the air pollution-wise, how, again, all the ecosystemic things that were coming together in order for the system to respond faster. That's where we see is the point of data. And then I shared something that we created called Right to Know, which contextualizes and gives insights of, like, this is what this means to you, or what it could mean to your community, but equally opening up an avenue for people to get in touch with us, rather than just being like, here's some numbers, go figure it out. Because I think that's a bit, well, it's unjust to do that, I think.
That's a great point. Thanks so much, Araceli. And I feel like we could continue chatting all evening. I would love to hear more from our panelists. They've just been such a brilliant contributors, but I'm conscious that our audience have been with us for an hour and a half. And so we're going to wrap it up now. Just to remind everyone that the deadline for submissions to the Clean Air consultation is the 3rd of May. We'll be making our submission available as a template for individuals and organisations and communities, along with a guide as to how to approach the consultation. And I'm also going to share in the chat box a couple of resources. So this is, oh, sorry, I just need to copy and paste it now. So the email that you need to send your consultation submission to, some resources that we've created on air quality and health in Ireland. And then I'm also just sending a link to the Centric lab and more of their work as well. And we will have the recording of this session available on Community Law and Mediation's website. And I know some people have been emailing already to ask if they can have access to Orla and Stig's slides. So if you send us an email to info@communitylawandmediation.ie, we'll forward those on to you. But thank you so much to everybody, especially to our panelists. And thanks also to Aoife and Liz at Community Law and Mediation for helping to set this up today. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.